Hello, and welcome everyone to our sixth Energy versus Climate webinar. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith, who celebrated a birthday yesterday and joins us from a different location with an unusual background. So quickly, David, where are you and why the background?
Climbing holiday in Penticton, where there's lots of great sport climbing because it's warm, and we're at a friend's basement climbing gym, which has been my office the last 2 weeks when I'm not climbing.
Great. And a belated happy birthday to you from the entire Energy versus Climate team, which comprises you and 4 others. So
Sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, hope you had a good day yesterday. So today, the focus of the show is on critical minerals. Much topic. So if it happens that if I ask questions that seem hopelessly naive, it's because they are. So I think, David, you might be in the same boat in terms of not knowing much about the topic, but generally you're a leg up on me when it comes to geeky niche topics.
Well, or willingness to opine without knowledge, maybe, because I don't know much about this.
Okay. So both David and I will be willing to opine about something we don't know much. Sara knows far more. And we thought, in the spirits of last night's vice presidential debate in the US, Sara's going to kick us off with an opening statement about the critical mineral opportunity for Alberta. And then David and I will respond with pointy questions, and we'll have a discussion amongst the three of us. After that, we'll open it up to Q&A from all of you. But 2 things in advance of that: the usual housekeeping reminders. So if you have questions, please send them in via the Q&A box. Don't raise your hand or use the chat box function. Use Q&A. If you like, you can always upvote someone else's question. And as always, our colleague Mika McFarlane, he's going to be on the hunt for live questioners. This is recorded for posterity for all time. If you're shy about that, you don't have to volunteer yourself. If you're not shy, we'd certainly love to hear you pose your questions to us live on the webinar. Okay, that was one thing I said before we get to critical minerals for clean technologies. The other thing is picking up on our discussion from 2 weeks ago with hydrogen. So we want to revisit the topic quickly, because on Tuesday, the province of Alberta released its hydrogen strategy as part of a document entitled its Natural Gas Vision and Strategy. And the Globe and Mail, with, I guess, in a peak of hyperbole, described it with a headline of "Alberta to diversify its economy with a big bet on hydrogen." The strategy included a couple goals: large-scale hydrogen production and deployment by 2030, but also exports of clean hydrogen and hydrogen-derived products across Canada, North America, and the globe by 2040. So maybe, David, can I turn to you first? What do you think of that strategy?
Well, this picks up on what we had in the last conversation, and I don't think my opinions have changed very much, but it's interesting to see it really moving into the government sphere in this way. I wanted to say serious way, but it's not clear this is serious in the sense that it's not clear there's that much money or legislative force behind it. But I think that while it is absolutely true that hydrogen could play a significant role as an energy carrier in decarbonizing some of the energy sector that's particularly hard to decarbonize. So I think that means heavy transport like shipping or aircraft, or some parts of heavy manufacturing or chemicals. I think there really is a role for hydrogen as an intermediate. I am skeptical about 2 things that really matter for Alberta. One, I'm skeptical that in the long run, there will be large-scale, long-distance movement of hydrogen. That is, there will be long-scale markets where the way there is for oil and gas, where oil and gas are traded globally. I think it's very unlikely, for reasons that I think are deep. They're to do with the fact that hydrogen is basically a lousy fuel. It has low heating value. It's hard to compress. It means it's expensive in energy and capital cost to do long-distance transport. And second, I think that while it is absolutely true that in the near term, right now, if you want carbon-free hydrogen at large quantities, doing it with natural gas and CCS, no question beats renewable hydrogen. I don't see that happening over the long run. And so it seems to me that in the long run, solar or wind hydrogen are going to beat natural gas with CCS hydrogen. And I think that long run is surprisingly quick, given where electrolysis prices are going, more like a decade. So I think the idea that there's this huge export market for Alberta that kind of essentially copies what we're doing with oil and gas and just strips out the carbon and sells to people the hydrogen, I feel it's it's a beautiful vision, but it seems to me very unlikely to work, both because it won't compete with other ways to make low carbon hydrogen and because there isn't going to be a large scale international market anyway. So again, I think we should focus on local developing technologies and world beating companies that figure out clever ways to use hydrogen as an intermediate.
Great. That picks up on themes we talked about last time, and particularly this point of debate around the true export potential of hydrogen when it's clear that people within oil and gas seem to be looking for a lifeboat, given perhaps tapering demand growth or flattening demand growth. And this seems to be the latest, greatest lifeboat. Sara, what did you think of it?
I agree with a lot of what David said. I would add another nail into the coffin of the export potential in terms of not just the eventual cost and difficulty of transportation, but also the question of, and whether you call it energy security or energy independence, but this increasing desire of countries to control more of their energy resources, especially as we're seeing, in kind of the COVID and supply chain world, that's getting more and more attention. And so, I think if you look to companies that are maybe weighing the idea of building a bunch of import infrastructure, that could perhaps get them cheaper hydrogen, at least at the near term, they might be willing to pay a premium even in the near term to be able to generate some of that more locally as well too. So I think that just adds another challenge to the export market. The other thing, I think like David was saying, that there was I think it's literally one line that was talking about the idea of building out key target end use applications. So I think it's great to see that in there. It's hard to know what that looks like, and in general, I think it's interesting that the Globe story, called it the Alberta announces the hydrogen strategy, in that this was, 2 pages in a 26-page document that spent the majority of the time talking about natural gas and growing natural gas use in the province and beyond as well too. So, it leads to a bit of a question about, where is that balance of focus going? Is it really into developing some of those new areas, or is it, weighted more heavily towards say natural gas for, uses that were previously seen?
Yeah, thanks,
I want to
Sara.
weigh in on one, pick up
go
on
ahead.
the CBC, just one comment on the CBC coverage quoted Nancy Southern, the ATCO chair, saying that basically in about 5 more years, this will work when the carbon capture and storage commercial nut is cracked. And that just struck me as an extraordinary comment. So I think I sat at a table with Nancy in around 2009 or so, discussing CCS. And basically it was the same thing 5 years away. And I think the reality is, if you're talking about CCS, meaning capturing CO2 from hydrogen production for natural gas, it's going to be there when governments demand it's there. The underlying technology is there. Major suppliers could supply it now. The issue is the political will to do it. And part of this kind of, when it's there in 5 years, sounds like a thing we used to hear from the US coal industry, where they keep talking about CCS as this thing that could save them, but it's in the future. And that's a perfect way to duck any real regulatory action, because it says, we've got the savior coming, but it's not quite here yet. So don't actually regulate us now, but just do R&D and get off our backs.
Yeah, the latest, greatest panacea. I used to compare that. And even though I work actively on carbon capture and promoting a tax credit for carbon capture, I used to joke when people would say, well, my gas plant is carbon capture ready. I'd say my driveway is Lamborghini ready. Doesn't mean I'm going to get a Lamborghini anytime soon. Or these days, I should say Tesla ready. Still working on that. But your point about Nancy Southern, someone recently said, and I think just yesterday, Nancy Southern is like the female equivalent of Jason Kenney. So that's all tongue in cheek. But what it means is that she really is reflective of thinking at the highest points of the province on hydrogen. For me, I have to fact check my friend Sara, because Sara, you said that it's 2 pages of the natural gas strategy. It's actually 3 pages.
Yeah, I stand corrected.
Yeah, so I fact checked you.
I want to stay honest.
Okay, but one of those pages had a lot of white space. within it. So yeah, one struck me as a hydrogen strategy, a lot of hype. It's skinny. It's 3 pages. The timing of the release was almost laughable because with this natural gas strategy, it had a big focus on plastics and plastics recycling and making Alberta a hub for advanced plastics recycling. The very next day, the feds announced details of their plastics ban. And so where did the story go? Not on hydrogen or other parts of the strategy. It all went to this, again, Fed-Prof conflict around plastics. So I think we lost a good opportunity around public debate with hydrogen. But what I will say, so on this export question and production question, I actually thought the strategy was reasonable in terms of its timelines because it talked about large-scale hydrogen with CCS, but only by 2030 with various applications. So it didn't say 2025. And if it talked about export, and I think that some exports will happen, I just think it's going to be a lot less than what governments and some in industry want you to believe. But it really said that that wouldn't ramp up until 2040. Bottom line for me, I think still all pathways to net zero for Canada pass through hydrogen. But while I thought the government of Alberta's strategy was reasonable on timelines, I'm still worried that all it takes is for a few loud voices to say we need $3 billion to develop a production and pipeline system by 2025, and we fall into the time-honored trap of over-promising and under-delivering on low carbon emissions or low carbon intensity technologies. And that could very well happen with hydrogen again. Okay, David, Sara, have we beaten the hydrogen horse to death now?
I think so. I mean, I think we'll be watching it to see what happens and what comes out of this strategy and where the money really gets spent. I know I will be.
Sure. Okay.
But I think the answer is no, we definitely haven't beaten it. It's clear that it has really risen, and it's risen in Canada at a high level in the feds as well. And I think what, I hope our little webinar can do and others is really get a serious debate about the way this might work, the parts of a hydrogen strategy that actually might make sense for Canada, because this is a time where governments might commit quite a lot of money over the next few years, not just Alberta. And we really don't have that many opportunities and we don't want to blow one.
Yeah. And a reminder, we had the episode on hydrogen 2 episodes ago. We can live on in the pantheons of reruns. If you want to know more about the topic, go check it out, Energy versus Climate, on our Substack site. All right, let's get to today's topic, critical minerals for clean technologies, and specifically the opportunity for Alberta and also Canada. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put up our poll. So the poll question: do critical minerals for clean technologies like lithium for EV batteries or vanadium for stationary storage? I have to practice that word.
Vanadium.
Thank you, vanadium. Well, I told you I was ignorant when it came to this topic. I can't even pronounce some of these minerals.
Wait till you run across molybdenum.
Oh, gosh. Do they represent a good opportunity for economic diversification for Alberta and therefore justify the environmental impacts that come from mining? And my question is, who put in vanadium into this question when I didn't know it would show up there? All right. So we got the poll answers coming in. We promised that we would begin with Sara. You're going to make an argument for why it's a good opportunity for Alberta, and then David and I are going to respond. So over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to be perhaps uncharacteristically optimistic in my outlook on technologies this time, although with a good dose of skepticism around where I see the challenges. But to start off, just to kind of set the stage about we hear all these words bandied about: critical minerals for energy transition. People like to talk about rare earths, lithium, minerals of the energy transition. What is that? So it comes from this concept that the low carbon energy system is one that is material intensive. So that is, everything from the trace elements like the rare earths that go into the magnets for motors, to steel and aluminum, that make up the bases and the towers for wind turbines. And then also things, of course, like lithium, nickel, copper, that go into electric vehicles in terms of the batteries, as well as the motors themselves. And so there's a lot of materials that are needed. As we move to a system that is lower in carbon, it's not necessarily lower in materials. There's different, there's different definitions or different elements that go into this question of what makes these materials critical. So there are some materials like steel, for example, that is going to be used in very massive quantities in these future energy systems, but has a relatively high diversity of supply. So, it's often not on the list for criticality. It's not something that people are particularly worried about running out of, but it still can be an important, product going into the future. Materials that are critical, it's usually looking at a combination of, there's going to be some demand for them. There's relatively low substitutability. So, there's not something else that you can use in its place instead, or just, leave it out. And that there's a relatively little diversity of supply. So typically, thinking about geographic diversity of supply. And so something like, lithium, definitely fits into that category in terms of, we know that demand is going to increase. Lithium is very special, being, the lightest metal. It's great for batteries for that reason. And it's a material that has a relatively concentrated supply. And so you can go through all the, there's different lists that different groups maintain about which materials are critical. So the next piece to understand also is, how big are we talking about, right? So we're talking about a lot of growth in the quantities, but that size varies quite a bit. So, for a rare earth like neodymium, you might be talking about going from, 10 kilotons to 200 kilotons, whereas, copper, it's something like 10,000 kilotons to, over 100,000 kilotons by 2050. So different magnitudes, and along with that goes different market sizes as well, right? So, an obvious question is, well, how does this compare? Are we going to be replacing, oil and gas revenues one for one? And there, I think the answer is probably no, right? This is an opportunity. It doesn't mean it's, the plug and play replacement. So we look at the global market for oil and gas, over $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion today. If you look at lithium, for example, we're talking in the billions today. There is, expected to be quite a bit of growth going up to the, hundreds of billions, and looking out to 2050. Similar, something like copper, 150 billion today, close to 750 by 2050. So that, gives you some sense of the size that we're talking about. And so the opportunity that I think does really exist for Alberta and Canada is to become, a producer, but also a processor and even an integrated manufacturer across the country. For example, and so let's take lithium as an example. Being able to, extract the lithium, turn it into the concentrate, do the processing, the next step in the battery production to producing, really battery-ready chemicals, and then all the way down the chain through the battery cell manufacturing, and then ultimately into the EV manufacturing, which we do see, Ontario, for example, with a recent announcement around Ford stepping up their EV manufacturing there. I think there's a real potential there. We're probably lagging a little bit behind in the demand side in terms of, seeing that push-pull dynamic of the pull for local demand for EVs, really driving that. But I think that we have those skills, right? We clearly have the extractive skills. We clearly have the chemical and processing skills, and then, looking across the country, the manufacturing skills. And so why I think that Alberta has a reason, or has an opportunity to compete with the rest of the world on this, is that, we do have some of these resources. If you look at Alberta in particular, lithium, definitely a big one in the brines. Vanadium is one that's also getting more attention. If you start to zoom out and look across Canada as a whole, there are a number of different, resources that are on those critical lists. And I think we can actually, if we get our act together, offer a secure source of supply with high environmental and social and governance standards for countries and companies around the world. And you see a little bit of this starting, to come together. I mean, there's I say starting, there's definitely companies and entrepreneurs that have been working in this space for some time, but it's starting to get a bit more attention with the convening of the minerals panel, for example, in Alberta. Saskatchewan actually actually has gone ahead and announced that they are going to be building a rare earths processing facility. You also see, some collaboration between the U.S. and Canada around, joint minerals development. So there's a real credible path to creating that future demand. And the U.S. is also increasingly becoming concerned around sources of supply. And so the question is, how do you really get going then on making sure that you're building up all the elements of that value chain that you need, that you're doing so in a way that is really structuring the industry to benefit Albertans, and both in terms of the value of the resource. So I think we'll talk a little bit about that. What it means about the risk of really staying in those commodity markets that we're in. Is there a way to think more downstream to make that a little bit of a better opportunity in the long run? Then, also, what does it mean for, the environmental impacts, right? That was with the polls in terms of, what does it mean? How are we going to have to see resource extractive companies working with Angos, maybe in a new and different way to move forward on this opportunity? And then I also think, as much as I am optimistic about the opportunity, as I did say, that the size, I think we need to be reasonable about how large that is. And I think we also need to be very careful thinking about, both the general commodity price risk and the fact that, these are markets that are going to be growing quite a bit. And so, how is the supply and demand balance going to grow over the next couple of decades? As well as the technology risk that's inherent in there. So the potential that you, shift to a different technology or away from a given resource. It's a really live conversation, for example, with cobalt, where there's, anytime I think there's a lot of motivation to get out of a certain mineral for some reason, there's a lot of engineering work to move towards that. So, certainly thinking very carefully before we put all of our eggs into, one mineral basket, because you might see, everything from, on the one hand, different battery chemistries, and then, even going to kind of the electric motor side, there's interesting work going on around new types of motors. So motors that don't require permanent magnets. So they would basically not use rare earths at all. It was actually Amazon's fund, I believe, that made an investment into one of the companies that are working on these so-called switched reluctance motors. And so they use basically some very careful current control to generate the magnetic field. And so I think, in some ways, we're only at the beginning of this kind of electrify everything pathway. And so, that's great in terms of, we're not necessarily trying to play catch up in the way that, Alberta would be if we wanted to become solar panel manufacturers or something. But it also means that there's some risk there about, knowing which pathway is going to be one that is profitable from a resource perspective in the long run. So maybe I'll leave it there as the introduction and the optimistic tinged with a sense of caution about where Alberta might play in this.
Great, and I think David and I have a few challenge questions that would like to put to you, or just better understanding the topic generally and where you're coming from. Two things before. One, the poll results show that essentially half our audience thinks that yes, critical minerals for clean technologies represents a good opportunity for economic diversification for Alberta. 10% roughly say no, and I don't feel so alone here because you got 40% of people saying I don't know. Just so people know, we're going to come back to this question in a few minutes, and you'll get to weigh in and let's see if we filled in knowledge gaps or you've developed or changed your opinion. So that's one. The other thing is we are going to get to Q&A, so please do keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. I see some coming in. All right, David, why don't you respond first?
So so first of all, it was really terrific for one of us, in this case, Sara, to be positive about something, because I feel like we've been the Debbie Downers so far in this podcast on every technology. And actually, I'm not as negative as I thought I might be. So I guess I see two big forces. One is Canada really is globally a major power in mining, not a superpower, but Canada, certainly punches above its weight in the mining industry, both within Canada and abroad, in terms of money, business power, and underlying technical expertise. And there really will be some increase, I believe, that is driven by this clean tech boom in some of these critical minerals. I think that's real, although I agree with Sara that there's a lot of technological substitution that can happen, so we shouldn't be overconfident. And then finally, when I think about Alberta, it's easy to think that what Alberta has is oil and gas expertise. But what is oil and gas expertise? To me, that really means a huge amount of blue collar, very skilled workforce. It means big engineering firms and engineering procurement management, EPC firms that are able to execute big projects. And it means lots of people with the expertise to put together big, resource heavy, operationally difficult billion-dollar class projects building something. That's the kind of core expertise Alberta has. And of course, the companies at the top, the companies that are the integrators, if you like, the Suncors are about oil and gas. But I think transitioning some of that underlying Alberta expertise to do mining is in some sense looks kind of easy. That is, it's much more plausible that you could put together the underlying human and institutional skill sets that we have in Alberta to go and really do a great job on some new mining activity than the idea that everybody's just going to get an IT job or be, building video games, where, I think that it's much more challenging to see transitioning some of the oil and gas people into that world. So I do take seriously Alberta has some of the right underlying skills, Canada has the mining, and that there really might be a market. I think some of my cautions on the market come from the long-term cautions about resource prices that come from the Simon Ehrlich bet, but I'll come back to that later if you let me.
Sure. Yeah, we'll definitely let you, and not just because it was your birthday yesterday, David. So I'd like to build on a couple points. So I too think that Alberta, it certainly has what it takes. Like, we do have the right people. We have no shortage of engineers. And engineers, as we know, are very adaptable. And I think more importantly, we've got the ecosystem that we need of finance. You have a Securities Commission. And if you want to kickstart a new sector or ramp up an existing sector, you really need that. And I think whether you're doing an oil and gas deal, or whether you're doing a solar deal, or whether you're doing a mining deal, we've got the financial types that are based in, frankly, Calgary, who know how to do billion-dollar deals. So there's nothing, I think, in terms of technical know-how or engineering capability or financial capability to prevent it. What I've got a couple of, maybe I'll translate these into questions, a couple of concerns. One is, I think, and unless I missed it, Sara, that we're kind of starting from scratch compared to other parts in the world, Chile, Australia, the Congo. And as far as I know, like taking lithium, it takes 10 years to build a lithium mine from scratch. So can we really ramp up in a time that meets growing global demand clearly for lithium, for EV batteries, again, to one example, or are we already too late? So that's one concern. And the other is, where in the supply chain do we play? Because we've got the mines that produce the raw materials, we've got the chemical plants that process those raw materials, say into battery chemicals, and then we've got the cathode and the battery cell manufacturing. But what parts of the supply chain truly make sense for Alberta? If you've got battery cells and cathodes that are built close to where the mines are, then what's left for Alberta is, the actual mining and then processing to battery chemicals. We know we can do the mining, but can we do the chemical processing? And in that case, are we just then, once again, like we're drawers of water and hewers of wood, are we at the very base of the pyramid in terms of value, and every other jurisdiction is getting the higher parts of the value, and we're left with the environmental liabilities at the end of the day? So that's my second question. One, on timeline, can we ramp up in a way that keeps us in the game? And two, what parts of the supply chain can we plausibly play?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the timeline one, and then David, you probably have some thoughts on this too. I mean, I really think that we're not too late, right? Like, so you look at the forecast and the way that you expect this demand to grow, it's not something that's going to grow from now to 2030 and then plateau. It's going to be continuing to grow. So, you look at the most aggressive targets for new EV sales, in some countries that are coming forward. I guess the UK just moved theirs up to 2030. But that's, that would be sort of the first round of all EVs coming out of that country. But that means that there's still quite a lot of vehicles in the fleet to convert after that. So I think that we're definitely not too late. It's true that we haven't been doing exactly at scale that kind of production previously, but that's where I do think that relying on some of the other resources that we have been producing before can help quite a bit. And so I think that I think on that where we risk, where time is an issue, is really around how you get and how you make that kind of pivot, right? Because we can talk about how there's a lot of overlap between, the sort of skills and know-how. But to David's point, there are these integrator companies, and some of them are, have expressed interest in these other areas, but they are still, core focused on their oil and gas business. And so, there is a real kind of political economy challenge around making that kind of pivot, even one that is so relatively close to our existing technologies. That's really not not to be dismissed. And I think you see it, frankly, in what we were discussing before with the natural gas strategy and the hydrogen 3 pages, not 2 pages out of that. But that's exactly the kind of question is, the majority of that was spent focused on the natural gas, and hydrogen, gets a little piece of it. And so, the question is, how do you kind of reverse that if we really want to make this move in a major way? And that's something that Alberta, frankly, we actually did it before, right? We don't sometimes realize it because some other things happen in the interim. But when the decision was made to go after the in situ oil sands resource, that really was a different type of resource. It was a different group of companies, largely speaking, and there was a lot of pushback from the incumbent conventional oil industry at the time. So it's certainly I guess I believe that we could do it because we did it once before, but I wouldn't downplay the challenge in it.
Fair enough. David, your opportunity to jump in.
Yeah, so I just want to inject a little caution about long-run prices of minerals. So it's natural to assume that minerals have some limited supply, and if demand's going to go up a lot, prices have to go way up. Maybe, but maybe less than you think, both because of technological substitution of the technology end, as we can use different minerals if one is too expensive, and because people persistently overestimate or persistently underestimate the innovation in our ability to extract stuff from the earth. And that's partly because people think of people who are not thoughtful tend to think of reserve to production ratios as reserves as being like a fixed bucket in the ground, like once it's gone, it's gone. And of course, that's not true. The way these things actually work is you've got a whole set of different buckets of different sizes and different qualities, and our technology for extracting those changes over time. And I think you need to look at some of these long-run history. So from the time the oil market kind of stabilized around the turn of the last century till the 1972-3 oil shock, oil prices were kind of stable at about $10 a barrel forever, despite this more than order of magnitude ramp up in production. And reserve to production ratios have been stable. That's basically because it doesn't make sense to look for oil beyond about a kind of 30-year economic horizon. It's not because we're actually out of oil. And the same is true for minerals. And for those of you who don't know, one of the most sort of biggest examples of a public bet in environmental history was between Paul Ehrlich, the father of the population bomb, you could look at him as an early environmentalist and really ringing the bell about the idea we were going to run out of all sorts of things and the world was desperate. This is the Club of Rome group, and an economist called Simon. And Julian proposed a monetary bet with Paul Ehrlich on a basket of materials. And the idea was if Ehrlich was really right, the world was running out of all this stuff, then the prices should go up. They made a formal bet, and Ehrlich crushed him. Ehrlich won. Simon crushed Ehrlich. Simon won hands down. The prices of basically all these things went down over time. And I think there's every reason to think that there are long-term forces that make that happen. So even though I do think there will be a bigger market, and I think there's some opportunity, be cautious about simple projections that use fixed prices of supply and fixed assumptions and produce very high price numbers.
Yeah, and I remember reading Matt Simmons' Twilight in the Desert around 03 or 04 and peak oil and thinking that we're going to run out of oil, prices are going to go up. And then oil did go to, it was $147 a barrel. And we all
Yeah.
thought, they're right.
Well,
And it crashed down.
yeah, but I think
It came down to yeah.
basically, yeah, we all thought, but I mean, sensible people didn't. Like, my best friend's father had been like doing sort of oil and gas related stuff forever, minerals extraction. I mean, I think people who were wise knew it wasn't true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, David. I think, the idea that demand goes up, yes. The idea that that means that prices are going to rise dramatically, that's really questionable, because as you say, you either figure out how to make them cheaper and get more out of it. And you've seen that on the mineral side too, that, even as ore quality has declined, the technological advances have more than made up for that. I was actually just reading an interesting working paper. Maybe we can post it with the link to it with the podcast. But that was looking at if you think about both the scarcity, so the amount of the material of the mineral within the crust of the earth, and the amount of energy that it takes to separate the mineral from, the whatever you find it in. People tend to think of that scarcity element as being the main driver of price. But what these researchers found was, you were able to decompose those different elements. And really it's the energy that's responsible for, something roughly like 50% of the price. And the scarcity, is close to 20. And then you get some other stuff coming in from, how toxic it is and some of these other things. But I think that has some really interesting long run implications too. If we think about, it's really about how much energy you're using to produce these, that will tend to drive us in the way that we want to be, which is producing materials, with a lower footprint, with lower amounts of energy use, at least.
Yep.
So definitely a lot more complex in the dynamics than, sometimes people are making it sound.
I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish a book about how the world is running out of vanadium. And as a result, it's going to forever transform global energy systems and supply chains. And then 5 years later, when that doesn't materialize, I'm going to write another best-selling book about how we're awash in cheap vanadium, and that's going to transform global energy systems and supply chains. And I say that tongue-in-cheek or facetiously because I've seen senior people doing that on the oil question and not batting an eye when they pivot. Listen, we got 25 minutes left. I think we should try to get to some of these Q&A questions. We've got AJ Gupta, who is going to ask a live question. So AJ, thanks for joining us, and please ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this this event as well. I'm really enjoying it and learning a lot. My question was in regard to justifying the environmental impacts. How can we justify the environmental impacts of mining when those impacts are largely unknown right now? How does the current environmental state of the extraction industries in Alberta in general add to these impacts we're assuming? And are there already LCAs for this kind of research? Thank you.
Cool. Either one of you want to jump in?
I'm willing to give it a shot, but it's in ignorance. So I do know something about LCAs, and I think justifying a decision like that is about some large scale cost benefit to society. And it certainly does depend partly on what the local impacts are. And I don't know about the specific impacts of doing that, but I think that broadly, there's a deep reservoir of environmental science that allows us to say something real about what the environmental impacts are of releases of contaminants, such as what happened from a mine. So I think there's something you can do, but the reality is we will never know accurately in advance exactly what the impacts are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's no question that anything that we do, as humans in the world has an impact, right? So I think we have to start from that point and kind of, then the question is, what do we do to minimize our impact? So, I mean, part of that actually, even in this whole energy transition piece, is the often forgotten energy efficiency, and the idea that, we need to do everything that we can to reduce the amount of energy that we are consuming. And then when you get to, we are going to consume energy, and if we know that we have some kind of carbon budget, then we have to find ways to produce it at lower carbon footprint. But there are very real, of course, environmental impacts from mining in terms of, air, land, and biodiversity and others. So, I think it's, when I think of this question of, is this what we should do in terms of, I think it's clear that we need to do things to reduce our carbon emissions. And so I think this is one part of it. I think it needs to be done with those other elements of how do we reduce energy demand overall. And then we need to be, doing it really carefully with an eye to those other impacts. And I think also an eye to the fact that, historically, we haven't been very good at thinking about the long-term impacts in terms of the, liabilities that tend to stay around when it comes to natural resource production. So, how are we going to do a better job at that, right? We're facing that now in Alberta on the orphan well side of things. So how can we, go into, if we are going to go into another round of natural resource development, can we do a better job thinking those issues through up front? So Ed, maybe you have some thoughts on that from your experience in that space.
Well, it's hard, and there's only, a lot of it, frankly, is lipstick on a pig when you're looking at a big mining operation. But Sara, you sent to us a World Bank report called Minerals for Climate Action, the Mineral Intensity of the Clean Energy Transition. And it seemed to me it was trying to unpack that concern that was raised most recently or most notably, and we did a podcast on this, on Jeff Gibbs and Michael Moore's polemic on Planet of the Humans, because they went after renewables, and one of the things they went after them for was the environmental intensity of rare earth minerals. So I must admit, I opened up this report, and to the question of LCA understanding the impacts versus understanding the solutions, that report was 98% a problem statement, and then 2% when you look at what can we do. It had like 2 pages on renewables opportunities in mining and 2 pages on recycling. And I thought, and I'm still not very well versed, surely there is more, but clearly just the implication of this report is we can't get around it, that there is high environmental intensity with some of these metals and minerals we produce. What we hope is that the end justify the means. And if we're pulling out lithium ultimately to produce EV batteries, or we're pulling out copper to produce wind turbines, that we hope then what we're doing in terms of reducing carbon emissions downstream justifies some of the environmental blight that we're unquestionably going to leave on landscapes. No matter what stories industry spin about remediation or looking up in the oil sands, we've got Plains bison and what used to be boreal forest, and isn't that a great story? What we're doing is massively altering ecosystems in a way that is, for the most part, irreparable. And I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of scathing emails hitting my inbox for saying that. But I will question back to Sara, if you've looked at this, are there some metals, not all metals and minerals are created equally. Are there some that have more of a benign or less of an impact, and others that are heavier in impact that we should avoid?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways into that, right? So one is like, what do you try to engineer out of your technologies that you're making because they are highly problematic? And I mean, cobalt is certainly on people's radar also just for the, kind of the other societal impacts around that. So that would be an example of, one way around that question. The other is, how do you really come up with new ways of extracting these materials? And that's where, again, I see a really huge opportunity for Alberta to say, well, we can, if we turn our innovation engine towards those questions, in lithium, there's the company E3 Metals, I know that's working on, some innovations around the direct lithium extraction, for example. Those to me are really exciting questions then about how you really reduce the footprint of the production of these materials that then translates downstream. I do still want to, of course, point out that, this is an important question as we think about what is the environmental impact of these things. What the LCAs show is that there's no question that, even today with the way that we produce all of this, that, a wind turbine or a solar panel or an electric car over its lifetime, is much lower in emissions than the fossil alternative too. So I want to make sure that we keep that in mind as well. That sometimes when people are raising this, it's in good faith to have a discussion about, how we improve things. And sometimes it comes with a bit of a dose of, trying to imply that it's not any better than what we have today, which just simply isn't true if you look at the numbers. And that's something that people have spent a lot of time calculating and looking at quite closely.
Okay, great. Well, we've got another live questioner, Dobromir. over to you. You have a question on lithium demand and batteries.
Hi, everybody. I would like to thank very much everybody for their speeches. It's really enjoyable to listen in and learn a lot from you guys. I have a question on lithium demand, as there's various sources reporting sort of mixed messages on the lithium supply and society as a whole running out of lithium supply. So my question is mostly in and around the technology innovation and improvements. So as published in numerous journals, to name a few, Nature, for example, recently they published about the lithium sulfur batteries improvements and the energy density going almost 5 times multiple of what would be a lithium ion batteries that they are used today. And Mr. Jeff Dunn published a paper on lithium metal batteries, reaching 1200 watts per kilogram. So I was hoping if you could maybe comment on the optimization and improvement of the lithium batteries going from 300 or 200 that's right now today all the way to 2400 for the lithium sulfur, which is the theoretical limit. Would you still see as society going towards running out of the lithium, or do you see that technology innovation can have a significant impact on slowing it down or even maybe never reaching that? Thank you.
Yep. Sara?
Yeah, I mean, that's the one where I think this idea that we're really going to run out of a critical material is, very unlikely to happen, right? Because one of two things will happen. Either you substitute it away because you're getting so close to the edge that it becomes quite expensive, or I think as you're pointing out in this example, it gets you get more efficient at doing doing more of whatever it is you want to do, storing energy, for example, with much less lithium. And so that's I think it's not something, it's something we see over and over again as well too, right? So I think there was an interesting stat I saw the other day about the use of silver within the solar panel industry, which has actually remained, the amount of silver that the industry uses as a whole has remained relatively flat over a period in which the production of solar panels has gone dramatically up. And so yeah, I think that we are often, and that's, I guess, a criticism that I would have of some of the models that are estimating future demand, is that they don't do enough of taking into account this improvement in technology, which doesn't necessarily mean that the ultimate demand will be a lot lower, because of course, the more you improve them, the cheaper they get, and then the more of them you can use too. So, it's there's a lot of dynamics behind these very simple graphs that people will show and say, I can tell you in 2050, lithium demand is going to be that amount. I think there we need to be very cautious, and we need to make sure that we're, working towards a sort of strategy for the province as a whole that is robust to, changes that we don't see coming.
Yeah, I was going to jump in with a sort of obvious Jevons comment. If you really had lithium sulfur batteries that were, 2,000 kilowatt hours, then that would probably drive demand for lithium up, not down. I think the big question is how long lithium ions will be so dominant in batteries. Is this really a long-term lock-in or not? So I was, for example, very persuaded, and I knew Jay Whittaker, who founded Aquion. He's one of the people that of all the people I brought into the Bill Gates meetings that I ran, he was one of the most really impressive guy. And yet Aquion really hasn't made it because lithium batteries just kept grinding along. And Jay, who is one of the top people in the battery world, is very articulate about why that's happened. And I think the question is, does it keep happening or does it branch? How stable is it? Will there really be different chemistries, or is it kind of a lock-in? And the obvious analogies to solar, where there was all this talk of different solar cells, and yet I think there's a good chance that silicon solar cells just keep grinding down the learning curve, and we end up with just better and better silicon. We never really branched anything else. I think that's actually a likely outcome for solar. For batteries, really hard to tell. I think there's still a lot of ideas for new chemistry, and I think there are things that I just think lithium batteries don't do, which are the really long-term seasonal scale storage demand. I just don't see them doing that. And I think there will be some other chemistry that does that. And so the question is, what chemistry and what does it use?
Gotcha. So I'd like to go to a question that we have, and Marianne Kenny asked, and clearly we haven't convinced everyone yet on Alberta having a competitive edge in critical minerals, because she asked, how does Alberta supply critical minerals for clean technology and ability to extract them compared to the supply and ability to extract of other jurisdictions? And this gets to an earlier point. Maybe we can, Sara, simply restate your argument. You look at, say, the Congo, and frankly, look at many places, or the Congo or Chile. Or there is just a piece in the Globe of the CEO of Sherritt, a Canadian company, talking about all the business that Sherritt is doing in Cuba and not talking about the business that they're doing here in Alberta. And clearly labor and the low cost of labor, or frankly, some of the lower, less stringent environmental regulations in those cases are competitive advantages and leading to a bunch of, oh, I forgot to give a shout out, a bunch of Canadian junior mining companies whose sins are well documented in this book from a number of years ago to go to places. So come back, like convince us again. How can we win that competition when they're just such cheaper and more lax places to operate?
I think we win it by standing on that reputation, and not just reputation, but actually delivering on it. So I do, for all our discussion previously about how, there isn't really anybody who's going to pay for more socially responsible or lower carbon oil. I do think that there are companies out there that will pay for, ESG, high ESG standards in minerals. And the reason that I think that is that you've seen that happen with renewable energy. And that's just spreading, right? So this is this practice, this corporate procurement where corporations are directly working with developers of renewable energy to sign contracts and build wind and solar for their use. Started out kind of niche, has now become quite a common practice. And some of those companies are continuing to ratchet up their ambition. So Walmart recently announced intentions to electrify their full vehicle fleet, including their delivery trucks, by I think 2040. And I think that they would be, open to this kind of idea of procuring minerals with a similar high standards. I think we haven't, not as much effort, and that industry hasn't gone as far yet. But I actually see that as a big opportunity for potentially some of the more junior miners, in Canada, to work directly with some of these corporations and sign some of these long-term offtakes, provide that higher environmental standard, which then we have to make sure that the laws are really there and they're being followed and all of those things. But I think that's really a credible case. And I think you see a growing number of companies that are really asking for that. I have my concerns about whether or not, we should be leaving that development to companies, and government shouldn't have a stronger hand in regulating that. But that does seem to be working in this case.
Got you. So I want to just quickly, before we move on to the next question, and talk about ESG and whether ESG is really a benefit for Alberta or whether it's a liability. And I've heard both things. On one hand, that ESG rules are not dictated by governments, they're being dictated by financial centers in New York and London. And on one hand, Alberta companies, led by oil and gas, they've got long histories and been working on ESG because of this huge lens and public pressure they've had with them, and they're more advanced. On the other hand, and I heard this from someone deep within the oil and gas sector and a major manager of an investment fund, he said, in Alberta, we're not an ESG benefit, we're a risk. And it's too easy for fund managers based in New York or London to hit their ESG targets and check their boxes simply by either avoiding any investment in Alberta or divesting from anything that they have. They check that box, and because Alberta, because of its performance in oil and gas the last 10 years, has generally a black eye internationally. So coming back to you, is ESG, what do you think? Is it a liability? Is it a benefit? And can the mining industry disassociate itself, say, with our track record on oil and gas, enough to go out and win ESG points?
The one, so I'll throw something and then David, to turn over to you. But the one counter example that I have is what's going on the corporate renewable procurement side, right? Where you do have international companies, like Starbucks and others that are looking at the potential to develop renewable energy in Alberta. So certainly once you get down to a level of the people that are really thinking about this stuff on the ground, they see the opportunity and they're not getting any indication, or they're not, being prevented from investing in Alberta in any way. So I don't think it's an insurmountable kind of reputation. To what extent there has to be an education of that opportunity, on the mining side, for example. I think that probably would have to happen. It certainly on the renewable side, it did have to happen in terms of just kind of making people aware that there was that renewable opportunity in Alberta.
Okay.
I do think there's a chance for Alberta to really make the ESG case. I think it's a fundamentally different problem. For oil, the central problem is the product. It's the emissions that come. The central problem that most people are concerned about politically is the product, the climate change that comes from burning it. And so Alberta's statements that are making ethical oil, that our oil was less bad in terms of its production chain than, say, oil in lots of other places in the world, those were true, but they were widely seen to be obfuscation and irrelevant because they weren't addressing the main problem people were actually concerned with, which was the carbon footprint. But I think for minerals, people are concerned about the production chain. And I do think Alberta, embedded in Canada, could make a real claim, if true, that our production chain could be better on various ESG metrics than, to pick an easy target, the Congo.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Since we're in the short strokes now of this episode, we've got 5 minutes left. We've launched our extra poll, and our extra poll is the same question. We want to see if we've changed minds. And based on early results, it looks like we probably have. Let's go to Caitlin Boyd's question. Considering the recent concerns expressed regarding the resumption of Alberta's coal policy and general opposition to mining in the Eastern Slopes region, how likely is it that new mineral mines will experience significant stakeholder opposition? She's got a two-parter. I'm going to leave it at the one part. So a little snapshot or foreshadowing. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about nuclear, and we'll have different views. And what I will say is that nuclear, if you looked at it and you're just a policymaker, you'd absolutely want it to be part of a low carbon future. I think it has a very small role to play in any expanded way because of stakeholder opposition, not necessarily based on fact, but just based on perception. And I think that this new coal mining could run into the same wall of public opposition due to perception. So, Sara, David, what do you think? Are we going to be able to develop new mines, or are you going to have people, like with pipelines, prepared to stand in front of bulldozers to actually stop them?
I think it's to me, there's a bit of an open question, right? So I think if you think about I agree with David's point that, the opposition fundamentally to the oil, part of it, I think, does come from the development, but a big part of it comes from the use of the product. And that's where not the coal, but the other minerals that we're talking about are fundamentally different. So, to what extent can you move beyond this difficult situation? I could paint it as a challenge to say we're in a situation where it's hard for these different groups to talk to each other and they're not going to make any progress. I guess the more positive spin on it would be to say, here is an opportunity where, two sides that have maybe been, having a hard time coming together and really at odds fundamentally over what they see as the future could actually align on, the same general goal, and then hopefully work together to overcome the differences. So, whether we fall into the first or the second category, I don't know. I guess that remains to be seen, and I think will require some hard work from people.
Yeah, NIMBY is real, not in my backyard. So there'll be local opposition to anything. That's just a given. But I think the question is how much political traction that opposition gets. And I think it's important to say that some of the reason that the opposition to, say, pipelines have got so much traction is that it's not just that people local to pipelines are actually worried about the pipeline's environmental impact. It's that those people have been coupled with big forces that want to act on climate and want to block the pipelines for climate reasons. And they've pumped money into those protests and given them a lot of oxygen and public visibility. And that's why those protests have had power. But if you're talking about, local protests trying to block a vanadium mine or a lithium extraction plant, I feel like those same convergence of political forces wouldn't apply. There'd be some local forces that don't want any particular thing, of course. But if this is part of a broad Alberta or Canadian focus on building this up, and there's not an obvious reason for large-scale organized opposition the way there was from the big environmental groups against fossil fuel pipelines, I don't see the same issue.
Got you. Okay, we just got a couple minutes left. We got 1 minute left. Poll results. So we've eaten into the I don't know vote. We've reduced that by half. So now we've got No's saying they're still at the same level, 10%. And this is do critical minerals for clean tech represent an opportunity for Alberta? The no's are the same level. The yeses have gone up by 17 points. The I don't knows have gone down by about 18 points, 6, 7%, 11%, 22%. So there you go. Sara, I think you presented a pretty compelling argument, and you shifted a bunch of people out of the I don't know camp into the yes camp. So if we had a bet ourselves, you've won that bet.
I missed opportunity, clearly.
I know.
I think I moved from no to I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I've shifted a bit to the I don't know camp as well. I don't think I'm in the yes camp yet. All right, I'm going to close us out. So this episode is going to be available on energyversusclimate.substack.com. And of course, available using your favorite podcaster, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever. Give us feedback at energyvsclimate@gmail.com. Thanks, as always, to our very patient producer, Eva Voinijescu, and of course to Mika McFarlane for all your support. That's it. In 2 weeks' time, and 2 weeks' time would be October, what date? 22nd. We're going to be talking nuclear, fission, fusion, SMRs, safety and security. We'll have fun unpacking it. So we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
You.
Take care.